On the eve of the COVID-19 pandemic, social progress had already slowed and stalled across multiple outcomes. Some inequalities widened during the 2010s. In this research, we share evidence of this by identifying 8 key areas of significance. Just before the pandemic started, 4.3 million children in the UK were living in poverty. That's 1 in 3 of all children in 2019-20, 500,000 more than there was 5 years previously in 2014-15. Some children are more at risk than others, and during the 2010s, poverty rates increased for children living in a lone parent family, in families with 3 or more children, and in families with a disabled adult. Between 2015 and 2020, rates were high and rising for children living in families from the Pakistani, Bangladeshi, Black African, Caribbean, British, and mixed multiple ethnic groups. What is living in poverty? Take a family with 2 parents and 2 children aged 5 and 14, then look at how much income after tax and housing costs they have per week. In 2019-20, the average UK income per head was £193, but those living in poverty had an income of £116 per head or less. By 2018-2019, 4 million workers were living in poverty, despite rises in minimum wages and employment levels. More than half of these workers were in full-time work. In-work poverty rates were particularly high among single parents and disabled workers. On the eve of the pandemic, inequalities in early childhood were already a major concern. In 2019, babies with a parent or parents from routine or manual occupations were 1/3 more likely to have been born with a low birth rate than babies with a parent or parents from managerial or professional occupations. In 2019, only 57% of children aged 4 to 5 in disadvantaged families achieved a good stage of development, compared to 74% of other children the same age. In this age group, children living in more deprived areas were twice as likely to be obese than those living in the most affluent areas, and obesity inequalities had been increasing. Even before the pandemic, children from some groups were being left behind in their educational attainment, and educational inequalities had begun to widen. More than 4 in 5 of all pupils got 5 or more GCSEs at grades A* to C in 2019 overall. But for pupils from disadvantaged families, only 3 in 5 did so, and this difference had got larger since 2015. New apprenticeship starts for young people under 19 fell by 1/3 between autumn 2015 and autumn 2019, particularly apprenticeships for people with lower educational attainment. Permanent exclusions from secondary school in 2019 were disproportionate. Compared to children from a white British ethnicity, children from Black Caribbean or mixed white and Black Caribbean ethnicities were twice as likely to be excluded, while children from Gypsy, Roma and Irish Traveller ethnicities were 5 times more likely to be permanently excluded. Rates for children with special educational needs were also high, while inequalities in exclusion rates between children from deprived and advantaged families had widened. Improvements in life expectancy slowed down and stalled during the 2010s, while life expectancy inequalities widened. Life expectancy for baby girls in the poorest areas declined, while the gap with baby girls in the most affluent areas had widened to 7.7 years by 2019. In that same year, baby boys in the poorest areas could expect to have lives more than 9 years shorter than boys born in the most affluent areas. Some people need help with things like dressing, washing, eating and moving around, but not everyone gets the support that they need. 2 out of 5 older people in the most deprived areas did not receive the help they required with meeting their daily needs in 2018. In the least deprived areas, this was only 1 out of 5, and this difference had widened between 2014 and 2018. Homicide is fortunately rare in England, with a rate of 11.7 per million in 2019-20, but despite improvements earlier in the decade, the homicide rate had increased per million, particularly for 16 to 24-year-olds. Black people were substantially and increasingly more at risk of homicide than white people, and by 2018-19, the homicide rate amongst black 16 to 24-year-olds is 24 times higher than for white 16 to 24-year-olds. The number of homicides involving a sharp instrument increased in the 5 years to March 2020. Recorded offences involving a knife or a sharp instrument were also on a rising trend. Domestic homicide, whose victims are mainly women, reached a 5-year high in 2018-19 before falling back in 2019-20. Homelessness, including rough sleeping, unsuitable temporary accommodation, and sofa surfing, rose in England in the decade prior to the pandemic from 8.5 to 9.2 per 1,000 households, and rose in Scotland in the decade prior to the pandemic from 5.1 to 5.7 per 1,000 households. If we are serious about recovering from the pandemic, we need strategies to address the inequalities that were already widening before COVID-19 hit, and to re-energise areas of social progress that had already stalled. Want to know more? Visit our Social Policies and Distributional Outcomes research page or download our report using the links below. You can also sign up to hear about future events by emailing us at case@lse.ac.uk.